Between November 8th and 12th, 1986, 14 people were eliminated across Detroit's east side in what would become known as the Williams Street Massacre. All adults, all connected to a single street crew operating out of 3 blocks on Chain Street. The method was calculated: drive-by shootings from stolen vehicles, close-range executions in abandoned buildings, ambushes on dark city streets where help never came fast enough. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or drug cartels or organized crime syndicates. They were 4 members of the Williams family, a father and his 3 sons, moving through Detroit like military operators, methodically erasing everyone connected to a single moment of disrespect. The Detroit Police Department would later call it one of the most systematic gang eliminations in the city's history. But the motive wasn't drugs, wasn't territory, wasn't even retaliation for a shooting. It was a public insult spoken at a dice game on November 1st, 1986. Words about a dead woman, a mother, spoken by a man too drunk and too arrogant to understand he'd just signed 14 death warrants, including his own. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Detroit's east side stretched across roughly 8 square miles of urban decay in 1986, home to approximately 75,000 people, most of them African American, most of them struggling. The area was bounded by Gratiot Avenue to the south, the Detroit River to the east, and sprawled north toward 8 Mile Road, where the city ended and the suburbs began. Population had dropped from 120,000 in 1970 to 75,000 by 1986, as white flight and economic collapse drained the neighborhood of everything except those too poor to leave. November in Detroit meant temperatures hovering in the low 30s during the day, dropping to the 20s at night. The cold came off Lake St. Clair with a particular bite that went straight through cheap coats and settled in bones already weary from surviving. The air smelled like a city dying. Exhaust from Detroit diesel buses grinding down Gratiot Avenue, mixed with the sweet chemical stink of crack cocaine being cooked in abandoned houses. Underneath it all, the metallic scent of old radiators working overtime in buildings the landlords had forgotten, and the acrid smell of trash fires burning in oil drums where homeless men gathered for warmth. At night, when temperatures really dropped, you could hear the city settling into its slow death. Ice cracking in gutters, wind rattling chain-link fences around empty lots, the distant sound of police sirens that never seemed to get closer, and every so often the pop, pop, pop of gunfire that people had learned to ignore because calling the police meant waiting 2 hours for a response if they came at all. But 1986 wasn't just another hard Detroit winter. The city was hemorrhaging population and hope in equal measure. The automotive industry that had built Detroit into America's 5th largest city was in free fall. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler had laid off over 100,000 workers since 1979. The massive plants that once ran 3 shifts were now running 1 shift or sitting empty, their windows broken, their parking lots overgrown with weeds. Unemployment on the east side hit 18% that fall. For men who'd grown up believing that hard work at the plants guaranteed a middle-class life, watching the economy collapse felt like a betrayal, of everything America had promised. The Reagan administration's war on drugs had flooded the streets with crack cocaine, and with it came a new economy. Not the organized hierarchies of heroin dealers from the 70s, but chaotic street-level operations run by desperate men selling $20 rocks to even more desperate users. Violence became the language of business. No corporate structure, no rules, just blocks and corners and young men willing to kill for patches of concrete that weren't worth dying for. Robert James Williams was 48 years old that November, though he looked closer to 60. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, but his shoulders had started to slope forward from decades of repetitive motion at the Ford Rouge plant. Bending over assembly lines, lifting engine blocks, performing the same movements 10,000 times till his body had permanently curved into the shape of labor. His face was deeply lined, weathered like old leather left too long in the sun. Deep creases ran from the corners of his eyes, carved by years of squinting into welding sparks and cigarette smoke. A thick scar cut diagonally across the knuckles of his right hand, a souvenir from 1974 when a press had malfunctioned and caught his hand before he could pull it back. The plant doctor had saved his fingers, but the hand had never worked quite right again. A slight tremor, barely noticeable unless you were watching him hold a coffee cup. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with early arthritis, calluses thick as boot leather from 30 years of manual labor that had ended abruptly in 1982 when Ford eliminated his entire shift. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the damage, the accumulated cost of a working life. Every morning, Robert woke at 5:30 in the house his father had bought in 1953, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at the kitchen table, reading one chapter from a King James Bible his wife Lorraine had given him for Christmas in 1968. He'd read slowly, lips moving slightly with the words, then drink his coffee black and strong, smoke one unfiltered Pall Mall cigarette rolled so tight it lasted 20 minutes, and begin his day. Robert had married Lorraine Elizabeth Jackson in June of 1968, right after he came home from Vietnam with nightmares that woke him screaming and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer and never showed anyone. They'd had 3 boys. Marcus was 26 now, back from his own tour in Lebanon with the Marines, a peacekeeping mission that had ended when a truck bomb killed 241 of his brothers at the barracks in Beirut. Marcus stood 6 feet even, lean and hard, with muscle built from years of loading trucks at a freight company on 8 Mile Road. He had his father's eyes, dark and watchful, always scanning for threats. A scar ran through his left eyebrow, souvenir from a bottle that caught him wrong during a bar fight when he was 19. Darnell was 24, quieter than his older brother, but just as capable. 5 feet 11 inches tall, stockier build from working construction when there was work, which wasn't often anymore. He dropped out of Cass Technical High School in 11th grade when their mother got sick, started working to help pay medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Travis was 22, the youngest, still trying to figure out who he was beyond being Robert Williams's son. 6 feet 2 inches, thin in a way that suggested he hadn't quite finished growing into his frame. He'd graduated from Denby High School in 1982, the only one of the three to get a diploma, but college was impossible without money, and jobs were non-existent. Lorraine had died in March of 1979 at 44 years old. Lupus, the doctor said, though Robert always believed it was the stress of watching Detroit collapse around them, of raising three boys in a city that seemed determined to kill young black men. Her death had shattered something in all four of them. Robert became harder, more rigid. Marcus enlisted in the Marines a month later. Darnell stopped smiling. Travis started getting in trouble. What Robert valued most wasn't money. He'd never had much anyway, and what little he'd saved had evaporated paying for Lorraine's medical bills and then her funeral. What he valued was legacy, memory, the physical proof that Lorraine Elizabeth Jackson Williams had existed and mattered and held their family together through everything Detroit had thrown at them. In December of 1978, 3 months before she died, Robert had taken every dollar from their Christmas fund, $237 they'd been saving for presents, and bought Lorraine a gold chain from a jeweler on Woodward Avenue. Not thick, not flashy, just 14-karat gold, 18 inches long, with her name engraved on a small rectangular pendant. Lorraine Elizabeth. Simple, elegant, real. She'd worn it every day for the last 3 months of her life. When she died, Robert had taken it from her neck at the funeral home and put it on his own. He'd worn it through 1979, 1980, 1981. Through the layoff at Ford, through Marcus's deployment, through Darnell's struggles, through Travis's arrests for petty theft. The chain represented everything. His wife's strength, her grace, her absolute refusal to let poverty or racism or dying destroy her dignity. It wasn't just jewelry. It was identity. It was the only thing of value the Williams family had ever created beyond their own existence. The only inheritance Robert could leave his children in a world where men like him had nothing else. By 1986, that chain had become sacred. Robert still wore it every day, tucked under his shirt where it rested against his chest, warm from his body heat. Sometimes he'd touch it through his shirt when things got hard, feeling the outline of her name, remembering her voice, her laugh, the way she'd made their small house feel like safety. The crew that controlled the 3 blocks of Cheene Street between Canfield and Forest wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. They were a loose collection of young men, teenagers, and 20-somethings who'd grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same schools, played basketball at the same parks before the rims got stolen and never replaced. No real hierarchy, no colors or hand signs that meant anything beyond their immediate blocks. Just friends, cousins, guys who'd known each other since elementary school and who sold crack cocaine together because there wasn't anything else. Marcus Henderson called Dolo since he was 12 years old for reasons nobody could quite remember anymore. Was 29 that November. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, built thick and solid, with a barrel chest and arms heavy from years of loading trucks at the Pepsi distribution center before they eliminated his position in 1984. His most distinctive feature was a gold tooth on the upper right side, installed after a fight in 1981 had knocked out the original. He had a loud voice, the kind of man who dominated rooms without trying, who told stories that kept people laughing, who remembered everyone's birthday and always asked about their mothers. Dolo's lieutenant was Kevin Davis, called Smooth since high school because of the way he talked to women. 27 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, lean build, always dressed better than anyone else, despite having no legitimate income. Smooth had 2 daughters ages 4 and 6, with a woman named Keisha who worked double shifts at Detroit Receiving Hospital, trying to keep them fed. He sent her money when he had it, which wasn't often enough. The crew numbered 12 men total, ranging in age from 19 to 32. Not hardened criminals, not cartel members, not organized gangsters. Just men who'd watched Detroit abandon them, who'd applied for jobs that didn't exist, who'd seen their fathers broken by plant closures and their mothers exhausted from working 3 jobs. November 1st, 1986. A Saturday night when temperatures dropped to 34 degrees and a cold rain had been falling since afternoon, turning the streets into mirrors of reflected streetlights and neon signs from corner stores. The dice game started around 8:30 in the evening in the alley behind Ray's liquor store on Cheene Street, a spot protected from the wind by brick walls on 3 sides and from police observation by its distance from the street. 10 men gathered in a rough circle, their breath visible in the cold air, passing a bottle of Hennessy and smoking Newports and Cools while they rolled dice against the wall. Marcus Williams was there with his brothers Darnell and Travis. They weren't part of Dolo's crew, never had been. But dice games on the east side were neutral territory where neighborhood boundaries temporarily dissolved. Money was tight. Marcus had $63 in his pocket from a day's work helping someone move furniture. Darnell had 40. Travis had 20 he'd borrowed from their aunt. By 9:15, Marcus was up $217. The dice were cooperating. Snake eyes when he needed them. Hard 8s, coming up 3 times in a row. He was careful, respectful, didn't talk trash, didn't celebrate too loudly, just collected his winnings quietly and kept rolling. Dolo was losing badly. He'd started with $400, money that was supposed to go to his aunt for rent. Money he couldn't afford to lose. By 9:30, he was down to $83 and getting desperate. The Hennessy wasn't helping. Neither was the cocaine he'd been snorting in Ray's bathroom every 20 minutes. His movements were getting jerky, paranoid. He kept accusing people of switching dice, of cheating, of conspiring against him. Smooth kept trying to calm him down, suggesting they leave, go get something to eat, come back when Dolo's head was clearer. At 9:47, Travis Williams rolled boxcars, double 6s, winning another $60 from the pot that Dolo had just contributed his last 42. As Travis reached for the money, his coat shifted, and the gold chain around his neck became visible in the streetlight. Lorraine's chain, the one their father had given Travis to wear that night because Robert had been feeling generous, had wanted his youngest son to carry something of his mother with him. Dolo, drunk and high and furious about losing rent money to the Williams brothers, saw the chain, and something in his cocaine-addled brain made a connection he'd never have made sober. He pointed at Travis, at the chain, and said the words that would kill 14 people, including himself. "Your dead mama can't save you from these dice, young blood. Maybe she should have taught you not to cheat, instead of dying and leaving you to rob working men." The alley went silent. The kind of silence where everyone knows something irreversible just happened. Smooth grabbed Dolo's arm, tried to pull him back, started apologizing immediately. "Man, he's drunk. He don't mean it. He's just mad about the money." But the words were already out there, hanging in the cold November air like smoke. Marcus Williams, 26 years old, Marine Corps veteran, stood slowly. His face showed nothing, but his hands had curled into fists. Darnell moved to his brother's side. Travis, 22, and still wearing their mother's chain, looked like he'd been slapped. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then Marcus said quietly, almost conversationally, "We'll see you around, Dolo." Collected his money, his brother's, and walked out of the alley. They drove home in silence, Travis still shaking, Darnell staring out the window, Marcus gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. At 11:47 that night, Marcus walked into their father's house and told Robert exactly what Dolo had said about Lorraine. Robert Williams sat at his kitchen table for 23 minutes after Marcus finished talking, smoking cigarettes, and saying nothing. His face was carved from stone, completely still, except for his right hand, which had developed a pronounced tremor. Finally, he spoke. "We handle this the right way first." November 2nd, Sunday morning at 9:15, Robert drove to the address Marcus had given him, a house on Mack Avenue, where Dolo's aunt lived, Geneva Henderson, 61 years old, a church woman who'd raised Dolo after his mother died. Robert knocked, waited, knocked again. Geneva answered, recognized Robert from the neighborhood, from years of seeing each other at the corner store, at funeral. Robert explained what her nephew had said, asked if she could arrange an apology, something formal, something that acknowledged the disrespect. Geneva listened, her face growing more troubled. She promised to talk to Marcus, to make him understand he'd crossed a line. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Geneva called Robert's house. Dolo refused to apologize, said he didn't remember saying anything, said the Williams brothers were lying, said he wasn't going to bow down to nobody over a dice game. Robert thanked Geneva politely and hung up. November 3rd, Monday morning, Robert went to Reverend Charles Mosley at Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, a man who'd buried Lorraine, who'd known the Williams family for 30 years. Robert explained the situation, asked if the Reverend could mediate, could bring both families together, could help find a peaceful resolution. Reverend Mosley tried, called Dolo, called Geneva, tried to arrange a meeting at the church. Dolo never showed up. November 4th, Tuesday afternoon, Robert walked into the 9th Precinct on Gratiot Avenue and asked to speak with Detective Samuel Hayes, a black officer who'd grown up 3 blocks from the Williams house. Detective Samuel Hayes listened to Robert's story, took notes, and then explained what Robert already knew. "Words aren't assault, Mr. Williams. Understand it was disrespectful, I understand it hurts, but there's no crime here. I can't arrest someone for being drunk and stupid at a dice game. If he threatens you, if he touches you or your family, you call me immediately. But this I can't help you with." Robert thanked him, shook his hand, and left the station. He'd tried every legitimate avenue: church, family, police, the system that was supposed to protect dignity, to enforce respect, to provide justice for grievances, had failed completely. Not because the system was corrupt, but because the system had no mechanism for what mattered most: a dead woman's memory, a mother's honor, the sacred bond between a man and his wife that transcended death. On November 5th, Wednesday evening at 7:30, Robert called his 3 sons to the basement of his house. The basement was unfinished, concrete floor and exposed pipes, a space Robert used for storage and the occasional poker game. He'd set up a card table in the center, spread out a street map of Detroit's east side that he'd bought at a gas station. Marcus, Darnell, and Travis came down the stairs and found their father standing over the map, a pen in his hand, their mother's chain hanging outside his shirt for the first time in years. Robert's sister Martha, 51 years old, a nurse at Harper Hospital, had arrived 10 minutes earlier. She stood in the corner, arms crossed, already knowing what her brother was about to propose, and already knowing she couldn't stop him. Robert spoke for 47 minutes, explained every attempt he'd made at peaceful resolution, explained why the system couldn't help them, why the church couldn't help them, why Dolo's own family couldn't control him, explained the old Detroit code, the one their grandfather had lived by, the one that said, "A man protects his family's honor regardless of cost." Robert Williams had learned how to kill methodically in Vietnam between 1968 and 1970. 1st Infantry Division, stationed outside Da Nang, hunting Viet Cong through jungle and rice paddies where every shadow could be death. The Army had taught him surveillance, ambush tactics, fire discipline, and most importantly, how to disconnect emotion from action when survival demanded it. For 16 years, he'd kept those skills buried, worked the assembly line, raised his sons, tried to be a normal man in a normal city, but normal had failed him. The law had failed him. God had failed him when he took Lorraine. All that remained was the training that had kept him alive in a war nobody understood. November 6th, Thursday morning, Robert drove alone to a house in Highland Park where a man named Curtis Doyle lived. Curtis was 63 years old, Vietnam veteran like Robert, Army Ranger who'd come home with demons and an attic full of weapons he'd never registered. They'd known each other since 1971. Drank together sometimes, never talked about the war except in the silence between words. Robert explained what he needed. Curtis disappeared upstairs for 20 minutes, came back with an M16 rifle wrapped in oilcloth, 3 Colt .45 pistols, and enough ammunition to start a small war. He didn't ask what Robert planned to do. Men like Curtis understood that some questions had answers you didn't want to hear. That night, Robert and his 3 sons drove to an abandoned Packard plant on East Grand Boulevard, a massive complex that had once built luxury automobiles and now stood empty, its windows broken, its floors covered in debris, and the evidence of vagrant fires. Robert had scouted the location 3 days earlier, found a section of the plant where they could practice without being heard from the street. For 4 hours, from 10 at night until 2 in the morning, Robert drilled his sons. How to hold the weapons, how to breathe, how to aim center mass because movies lied about headshots, how to move quietly, how to use cover, how to reload under stress. Marcus picked it up fastest, his Marine training creating muscle memory. Darnell struggled with the pistol's kick, but adapted. Travis, the youngest, kept flinching, kept hesitating, kept asking if they really had to do this. November 7th, Friday, felt like the last normal day the Williams family would ever have. Robert woke at 5:30, made coffee, Read Psalms, chapter 37. The Lord laughs at the wicked, for he knows their day is coming. He cooked breakfast for his sons, scrambled eggs and toast, the same meal Lorraine used to make on Saturdays when they were children. They ate in silence, the kitchen filled with the sound of forks on plates and the refrigerator's hum. Marcus had called in sick to work. Darnell had no job to call. Travis had stopped pretending he was looking. At 2 p.m, Robert's sister Martha arrived uninvited, let herself in with the key she'd had for 30 years. She found Robert in the living room cleaning the M16 with solvent and rags spread across newspaper. Martha sat on the couch, watched her brother work for 5 minutes before speaking. "This ain't gonna bring her back, Robert. You know that. 14 men won't equal 1 Lorraine." Robert continued cleaning, didn't look up. "This ain't about bringing her back. This is about making sure her name means something. Making sure disrespecting the dead has consequences. Making sure our sons know their mama's memory is worth defending." Martha tried for an hour. Talked about prison, about how his sons would lose their father, same way they lost their mother. Talked about Lorraine, about how she'd never wanted violence, how she'd raised those boys to be better than the streets. Talked about God, about forgiveness, about turning the other cheek. Robert listened to everything, nodded occasionally, kept cleaning weapons. When Martha finally left at 3:45, crying, Robert walked her to the door and hugged her for a long time. "Tell my story, right?" he said. "Make sure people understand why." That evening, Robert gathered his sons one final time, gave them each a chance to walk away, to refuse, to choose a different path. Marcus spoke first. "Mama raised me. I'm in." Darnell nodded. "For Mama. Always." Travis, 22 years old, the one who'd been wearing the chain, the one Dolo had insulted directly, took longest to answer. November 8th, 1986. A Saturday that started cold and stayed cold. Temperatures never climbing above 29 degrees, despite clear skies and bright sun that seemed to mock the darkness coming. The Williams family spent the day in forced normalcy, watching television, playing cards, eating leftovers. Robert cleaned the weapons one final time. Marcus reviewed the list of names and addresses they'd compiled through a week of surveillance. Darnell checked the stolen license plates they'd attached to Robert's Chevy Caprice. Travis sat in his room staring at their mother's photograph, the one from 1976 where she was smiling at a church picnic, young and healthy, and completely unaware she had 3 years left. At 10:45 that night, the 4 Williams men left their house on McClellan Avenue. Robert drove, Marcus in the passenger seat with the list, Darnell and Travis in back with the weapons wrapped in blankets. The streets were quiet, most people inside against the cold, only a few cars moving through intersections where streetlights had been shot out years ago and never replaced. Their first target was Kevin Davis, called Smooth, Dolo's lieutenant. 27 years old, father of 2 daughters he actually supported, a man who'd tried to stop Dolo from insulting Lorraine, who'd apologized immediately, who by any reasonable measure didn't deserve what was coming. But he was Dolo's right hand, and the code demanded completeness. At 11:15, they found him outside his apartment building on Mack Avenue, sitting in his car with the engine running, warming it up before driving to see his daughters. Marcus walked up to the driver's side window, carrying the .45, face covered with a ski mask, tapped on the glass. Smooth looked up, saw the gun, tried to reach for his own weapon in the glove compartment. Marcus fired 3 times through the window. 2 shots hit Smooth in the chest, 1 in the neck. He died slumped over the steering wheel, blood spreading across his Sean John jacket, the radio still playing Anita Baker. They left Smooth's body in the car and drove away at normal speed. No screeching tires, no attention drawn. At 11:47, they found Raymond Johnson, called Lil Ray, Dolo's 23-year-old cousin. He was pumping gas at a Sunoco station on Gratiot Avenue, completely unaware that Smooth had been killed 32 minutes earlier. Darnell walked up behind him as he replaced the gas cap, put the pistol against the base of his skull, fired once. Lil Ray dropped between the pumps, dead before he hit the ground. The attendant inside the bulletproof booth saw nothing, heard nothing over the sound of the television. At 12:33 in the morning, now technically November 9th, they found Terrence Brown, called T-Money, Dolo's main dealer. 25 years old, 2 children with a woman in Roseville, sitting in his Oldsmobile Cutlass on McDougal Street, counting money from the night's sales. Travis approached from the passenger side, his first kill, hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the pistol. He fired 4 times through the window, hit T-Money twice in the shoulder and once in the head. The 4th shot went through the windshield. T-Money died instantly. $6,300 in small bills scattered across his lap. By 2 in the morning, they'd returned home, parked the car in the garage, hidden the weapons in the basement behind the furnace. None of them could sleep. They sat in the living room, lights off, saying nothing, each processing what they'd just done. Robert's hands had stopped trembling. Marcus felt nothing, his Marine training having kicked in completely, turning the kills into missions accomplished. Darnell kept seeing Lil Ray's face in the moment before the shot. Travis had vomited twice in the garage. November 9th, Sunday, they attended Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church at 10 in the morning, sat in the same pew where Lorraine's funeral had been held. Reverend Mosley preached about forgiveness. Robert held his mother's chain, felt its weight, and planned the next attacks. November 9th through 11th passed in a blur of systematic elimination. Each member of Dolo's crew was found, isolated, and killed with the same clinical precision Robert had learned in Vietnam. Antoine Miller, 19 years old, newest member of the crew, shot while walking home from his girlfriend's house on Monday night. Deshaun Foster, 24, killed in his mother's basement where he'd been sleeping since losing his apartment. Marcus Thompson, 32, the oldest member of the crew, found in his car outside a party store on Tuesday afternoon. Jerome Little, 21, ambushed coming out of his job interview at a McDonald's on Van Dyke Avenue, the only legitimate employment any of them had attempted in months. Each man received the same treatment: quick confirmation of identity, execution-style shooting, immediate departure. No words spoken, no explanations given, just the systematic erasure of everyone connected to Dolo's operation. By Tuesday night, November 11th, Detroit police knew they had a coordinated massacre happening. 10 bodies in 3 days, all connected to the same 3-block territory on Chain Street. All killed with the same weapons based on ballistics. Detective Samuel Hayes, the same officer who'd told Robert Williams there was nothing he could do about words at a dice game, now stood in the precinct looking at crime scene photos and knowing exactly who was responsible. He'd seen the look in Robert's eyes when he'd left the station. He'd heard the resignation in his voice, the acceptance that the system had failed. Hayes knew what was coming, but knowing and proving were different things. He put out alerts for Robert Williams and his sons. By then it was too late. Wednesday, November 12th, 4:30 in the morning. The coldest night of the month so far, with temperatures dropping to 19 degrees and frost covering every surface in the city. The abandoned Packard plant on East Grand Boulevard sprawled across 40 acres of Detroit's industrial past, a massive complex of connected buildings where luxury automobiles had once been assembled by thousands of workers. Now it stood empty, a monument to manufacturing's death, its windows all broken, its floors covered in debris, graffiti, and the detritus of vagrant camps. Marcus Henderson, called Dolo, had been hiding here since Monday, when he'd heard about Smooth's death and realized he was being hunted. He wasn't alone. His younger brother Tyrell, 19 years old, had refused to leave him. Tyrell wasn't part of the crew, had never sold drugs, had never been in trouble beyond a truancy charge in high school. He worked at a McDonald's on Gratiot Avenue, sent money to their Aunt Geneva, had plans to attend community college in January. But he was Dolo's brother, and loyalty meant more than safety. They'd been sleeping in shifts on the 3rd floor of the main building, near a fire escape that offered a quick exit. They had 2 guns between them, a .38 revolver that Dolo kept in his waistband, and a .22 pistol that Tyrell had never fired. They had 3 blankets against the cold, 2 boxes of crackers, and a growing certainty that they weren't going to survive the week. The Williams family found them through information purchased from a crackhead named Little James, who'd seen Dolo entering the plant on Monday night. $20 bought the location. Robert, Marcus, Darnell, and Travis entered the Packard plant at 4:47 in the morning through a ground floor entrance that had been pried open years ago. They moved through the darkness using flashlights, clearing rooms systematically, Robert's military training evident in every movement. They found Dolo and Tyrell on the 3rd floor at 5:12. The confrontation lasted 7 minutes. Dolo saw them coming, tried to run toward the fire escape, slipped on ice that had formed on the floor from a broken pipe. He fell hard, the .38 skittering away across concrete. Tyrell tried to grab it, his hands shaking, managed to pick it up before Marcus kicked it away and put his own pistol against the boy's head. "Don't," Robert said quietly. "He ain't part of this." Marcus hesitated, looked at his father, then stepped back. Tyrell scrambled away, pressed himself against a wall, watching. Robert walked slowly to where Dolo lay on the ground, stood over him for a long moment. Marcus Henderson up at the man whose wife he'd insulted 9 days earlier, saw his own death in Robert Williams's eyes, and understood too late that words have weight. that disrespect carries cost, that some codes are written in blood. Robert's voice was quiet, almost conversational. Say what you said about my wife. Say it again so I know you remember. Dolo's voice shook. Man, I was drunk. I didn't mean nothing by it. I'm sorry. Robert shook his head. Too late for sorry. Say the words. Say what you said about Lorraine. Dolo closed his eyes. Your dead mama can't save you. Robert shot him once in the chest, watched him die over the next 43 seconds, choking on his own blood, trying to speak, but only managing bubbles of red foam. When Dolo stopped moving, Robert turned to leave. That's when Travis, 22 years old, the youngest son, the one who'd been wearing Lorraine's chain the night of the insult, saw Tyrell pressed against the wall and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He can identify us, Travis said. Can't leave witnesses. Robert turned, looked at Tyrell Henderson, 19 years old, McDonald's employee, innocent in every way that mattered, and saw the fear in his eyes. The boy hadn't done anything, hadn't sold drugs, hadn't insulted anyone, had only made the mistake of loving his brother enough to die with him. Robert opened his mouth to say no, to draw the line, to refuse to kill innocents, but Travis had already raised his pistol, had already fired twice, had already dropped Tyrell Henderson into a spreading pool of blood that mixed with his brother's. The sound of the shots echoed through the empty plant, came back to them distorted and strange. Marcus stared at his younger brother. Darnell turned away. Robert felt something break inside him that would never heal. They'd crossed a line. Not the line between law and crime. They'd crossed that days ago. This was the line between justice and murder, between defending honor and becoming monsters. They left the Packard plant at 5:19 in the morning, drove home in absolute silence, and waited for the police they knew were coming. Detective Samuel Hayes had been awake for 37 hours when the call came in about 2 bodies found in the Packard plant at 6:23 Wednesday morning. He'd known this was coming, had known since Monday that Robert Williams wouldn't stop until Dolo was dead. What he hadn't anticipated was the body count, the systematic thoroughness, the absolute commitment to erasing everyone connected to that November 1st dice game. 14 bodies in 4 days. The FBI was already involved. The mayor's office was demanding arrests. The Detroit Police Department, understaffed and overwhelmed by the crack epidemic, needed this solved immediately. Hayes didn't need to solve it. He already knew. November 14th, Friday morning at 6 o'clock sharp, 3 police cars and a SWAT van surrounded the Williams house on McClellan Avenue. Hayes had waited deliberately, given Robert and his sons 36 hours after the final killings, not out of sympathy, but out of respect for a man he'd known peripherally for 20 years, a man who'd tried to do things the right way before the system failed him. The raid was textbook. SWAT breached the front door with a battering ram at 6:03. Officers flooded into the house, weapons drawn, shouting commands. They found Robert Williams sitting at his kitchen table drinking coffee, wearing Lorraine's chain outside his shirt. Marcus was in the living room, hands already raised. Darnell was in his bedroom, sitting on the bed, staring at nothing. Travis was in the bathroom, vomiting from stress and guilt. None of them resisted. None of them ran. They'd known this moment was inevitable from the second they'd decided to hunt Dolo's crew. Robert had even prepared for it, writing a confession letter the night before, sealing it in an envelope addressed to Detective Hayes, leaving it prominently on the kitchen table where it couldn't be missed. The arrest was captured by news cameras that had been tipped off anonymously. Hayes suspected by someone in the department looking for publicity. Video footage showed Robert Williams, 48 years old, being led from his house in handcuffs, his face completely calm, almost peaceful. Marcus walked behind him, head high, Marine bearing evident even in surrender. Darnell looked shell-shocked, suddenly understanding the permanence of what they'd done. Travis was crying, had been crying since the police arrived, would continue crying through booking and arraignment, and the first 3 months in Wayne County Jail. The search of the Williams house yielded overwhelming evidence. The weapons hidden behind the furnace, still containing ballistic evidence, linking them to all 14 murders. The street map marked with addresses and surveillance notes. Robert's confession letter, 4 pages of careful handwriting explaining exactly why he'd done what he'd done, naming every victim, describing every killing, accepting full responsibility. Marcus's notebook containing details of Dolo's crew, their routines, their locations, their vulnerabilities. They'd kept everything, not because they were stupid, but because they'd never intended to get away with it. This wasn't a crime they hoped to escape. It was a statement they needed the world to understand. By Friday afternoon, all 4 Williams men had been charged with 14 counts of first-degree murder. Bail was denied. The prosecutor, a black woman named Diana Mitchell, who'd grown up in the same neighborhood as the Williams family, stood before cameras and explained that regardless of provocation, regardless of disrespect, regardless of system failure, the law was clear. Premeditated murder of 14 people carried mandatory life sentences. There would be no plea deals, no reduced charges, no mercy. The news coverage split along predictable lines. White suburban media portrayed it as gang violence, drug-related revenge, the kind of senseless, urban crime that proved Detroit's moral collapse. Black community radio told a different story. They talked about Dolo's insult, about a mother's memory being disrespected, about a father pushed beyond limits when every legitimate institution failed to defend his family's honor. They didn't excuse the murders, but they understood the context in a way that police reports and criminal charges couldn't capture. The East Side neighborhood where both the Williams family and Dolo's crew had lived descended into a strange quiet. No protests, no riots, no demands for justice, just a heavy silence that felt like grief and understanding mixed together. People stopped settling disputes publicly. Mothers kept their children closer. Men thought twice before speaking carelessly about the dead. The Williams case had demonstrated that the old codes still existed beneath the surface of modern law, and those codes demanded blood for certain violations. Detective Samuel Hayes gave one statement to the press on November 15th, standing outside the 9th Precinct, choosing his words carefully. The Williams family has been arrested and charged with 14 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence is overwhelming. They will face trial and, I have no doubt, conviction. But I want to say something else, something the prosecutor won't say and the law doesn't recognize. This tragedy started with a failure, a failure of respect, a failure of community, a failure of systems that should have provided mechanisms for resolving grievances before they escalated to violence. The law will punish Robert Williams and his sons, but the law can't answer the deeper question of what we owe each other, how we protect dignity when institutions won't, where we draw the line between honor and horror. That's something each of us has to answer for ourselves. The trial began on March 16, 1987, in Wayne County Circuit Court before Judge Patricia Coleman, a black woman who'd been on the bench for 12 years and had presided over hundreds of murder cases, but never anything like this. The prosecution's case took 3 weeks to present, methodical and overwhelming. Ballistics evidence linking the weapons found in the Williams basement to all 14 murders. Security camera footage from the Sunoco station showing Darnell Williams approaching Lil Ray Johnson moments before his death. Testimony from Little James, the crackhead who'd sold information about Dolo's location, now in protective custody and terrified. Robert's confession letter, entered into evidence and read aloud in court. 4 pages of careful explanation that sounded more like a philosophy treatise than a criminal admission. Autopsy reports for all 14 victims, each one driving home the reality of what the Williams family had done. Kevin Davis, called Smooth, 27 years old, survived by 2 daughters who would grow up without their father's child support. Raymond Johnson, called Lil Ray, 23, survived by a mother who would bury her only son in the same cemetery where she'd buried her husband 3 years earlier. Terrence Brown, called T-Money, 25, survived by 2 children who would only know their father through photographs. Antoine Miller, 19, survived by a girlfriend who was 3 months pregnant with his child when he died. Deshaun Foster, 24, survived by a mother who would die of a heart attack 2 years later. The doctor saying grief had literally broken her heart. The list continued, each victim given individual attention, each family's loss acknowledged, each destroyed future counted. The defense, led by a court-appointed attorney named Marcus Freeman, who'd taken the case knowing it was unwinnable, tried to present the context. He called character witnesses who testified about Robert Williams's 30 years of honest work, his service in Vietnam, his reputation as a devoted father. He called Reverend Mosley, who explained Lorraine Williams' importance to the family, her death's impact, the weight of her memory. He attempted to call Geneva Henderson, Dolo's aunt, to testify about her nephew's refusal to apologize, but the prosecution objected and Judge Coleman sustained it. Freeman tried to introduce testimony about Detroit's economic collapse, about unemployment, about system failure, about the absence of legitimate mechanisms for defending honor. The prosecution objected to every attempt. Judge Coleman agreed. This isn't about economics or sociology or philosophy, she ruled. This is about whether these 4 men committed 14 premeditated murders. The context is irrelevant to guilt. Save it for sentencing. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury, 7 black members, 5 white, deliberated for 11 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts for Robert, Marcus, and Darnell Williams. For Travis, the youngest, they found him guilty of 13 counts, acquitting him only of the murder of Tyrell Henderson after defense testimony suggested he'd acted impulsively rather than as part of the conspiracy. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Judge Coleman, known for her measured approach and careful consideration, spent 47 minutes explaining her decision. She acknowledged the provocation, the insult, the system's failure to provide remedy. She quoted from Robert's confession letter, from witness testimony, from her own understanding of codes that existed before law and would persist after it. Then she imposed the only sentences the law allowed. Robert Williams, 48 years old, life in prison without possibility of parole. Marcus Williams, 26, life without parole. Darnell Williams, 24, life without parole. Travis Williams, 22, 25 years in state prison. Eligible for parole after serving 85%. The courtroom erupted. Victims' families screamed that it wasn't enough, that life sentences didn't equal 14 deaths. Robert's sister Martha collapsed in the gallery, had to be carried out by bailiffs. The Williams sons showed no emotion. They'd known this outcome from November 8th, when they'd fired the first shots. Robert, asked if he wanted to make a statement before being taken to Jackson State Prison, stood and spoke for 3 minutes. "I don't ask for forgiveness," he said. "I don't ask for understanding. I did what I did, knowing the cost. My wife, Lorraine Elizabeth Williams, was disrespected in the worst way a dead woman can be disrespected, and every institution I turned to for remedy failed. The church couldn't help, the family couldn't help, the police couldn't help, so I helped myself. The old way, the way my grandfather taught me, the way Detroit used to work before law replaced honor. I killed 14 men. Some of them deserved it, some of them didn't. That's something I'll carry to my grave. But I don't regret defending my wife's memory. I only regret that it cost my sons their futures. They followed me because I raised them to believe that family honor matters more than personal safety. That's on me, not them." He sat down. The bailiffs led him away. He would die in Jackson State Prison 23 years later, in March 2010. 61 years old, having never shown remorse. The destruction rippled outward in ways the criminal justice system never measured. Marcus Williams adapted to prison, joined a Muslim community, spent his life sentence reading and trying to find meaning in choices that had no meaning. Darnell deteriorated, developed schizophrenia, exacerbated by guilt, spent 15 years in psychiatric units within the prison system. Travis, released in January 2011 after serving 23 years and 9 months, returned to a Detroit he didn't recognize, gentrified in some areas, more abandoned in others, unable to find work with 14 murder convictions on his record, even though he'd been acquitted of one. He lived with his Aunt Martha until she died in 2015, then disappeared into Detroit's homeless population. The 14 victims' families scattered. Some stayed in Detroit, trapped by poverty and the refusal to abandon the graves of their loved ones. Some moved to suburbs, to other states, anywhere that didn't carry the memory of November 1986. Kevin Davis's daughters were raised by their mother, Keisha, who never remarried, who worked 3 jobs to keep them fed, who died at 49 from exhaustion the doctors called a stroke, but family was just life's accumulated weight. Tyrell Henderson's mother never recovered. the death of an innocent son killed simply for loving his brother, broke something that couldn't be fixed. She stopped leaving her house, stopped attending church, stopped speaking to neighbors who whispered that maybe Dolo had brought this on himself. Dolo's Aunt Geneva, the one who'd tried to make her nephew apologize, spent the rest of her life asking what if. What if she'd forced him, physically dragged him to Robert Williams' house, made him say the words? Would 14 people still be alive? She died not knowing, haunted by a question that had no answer. 38 years have passed since that November in Detroit, when honor and horror became indistinguishable, when a dice game insult became a death sentence for 14 men, when 4 members of the Williams family decided that defending a dead woman's memory was worth sacrificing everything, including their own freedom. The Detroit that existed in 1986 is gone now, replaced by something simultaneously worse and better, more abandoned in some areas, more gentrified in others, forever changed by forces larger than any individual tragedy. The population has dropped from 1.1 million in 1986 to 639,000 in 2024. Entire neighborhoods have been demolished. The automotive plants that once employed hundreds of thousands now run with robots and a skeleton crew. The crack epidemic that fueled the violence of the 80s has been replaced by opioids, by fentanyl, by new ways of destroying the same communities. But Detroit persists, adapts, survives in the way cities do when their people refuse to abandon them completely. The Packard plant, where Dolo and Tyrell Henderson died, still stands, though barely. Parts of it have collapsed from neglect. Investors keep announcing plans to redevelop it, to turn it into lofts or mixed-use space, but the financing never materializes and the ruins remain. Urban explorers photograph it. Artists paint it. Homeless people camp in its vast emptiness. On cold November nights when temperatures drop near 20 degrees, some claim they can still hear echoes in the 3rd floor where 2 brothers died, though that's probably just wind through broken windows and the human need to make meaning from tragedy. The house on McClellan Avenue, where Robert Williams raised his sons, was sold in 1992 to pay legal fees. The new owners, a family from Ohio who knew nothing of its history, lived there for 8 years before the neighborhood became too dangerous and too depressed to sustain property values. It sat empty from 2000 until 2017 when it was demolished as part of Detroit's blight removal program. Today, it's an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, indistinguishable from 10,000 other empty lots across the city. Cheney Street, where the dice game happened, where the insult was spoken, where 14 death warrants were signed with drunken words, has undergone its own transformation. The liquor store where Ray used to run his operation closed in 1994, sat abandoned for 20 years, was finally torn down in 2014. A community garden exists there now, maintained by a church group trying to bring fresh vegetables to a food desert, completely unaware that the soil they're tending is 20 feet from where Lil Ray Johnson bled out between gas pumps. The neighborhood has gentrified slightly, young white professionals moving in, buying cheap houses, opening coffee shops and craft breweries, fundamentally unaware of the history beneath their carefully renovated hardwood floors. Children play on sidewalks where men once hunted each other. Joggers run past buildings where bodies were found. Life continues its relentless march forward, covering scars with layers of normalcy, until they almost disappear. Almost. Detective Samuel Hayes retired from the Detroit Police Department in 2003 after 34 years of service. He died in 2019 at 71 years old. And in a podcast interview recorded 6 months before his death, he spoke about the Williams case for the first time in detail. Legally, Robert Williams was a mass murderer, he said, his voice tired but clear. 14 premeditated killings, carefully planned, systematically executed. The law is absolutely clear about that. But morally, it's more complicated than any courtroom can acknowledge. He was a man who'd done everything right. Worked hard, served his country, raised his sons, loved his wife. And when she died, he kept her memory sacred the only way he knew how. Then someone disrespected that memory in the worst possible way, and every single institution he turned to for help said, "Sorry, we can't do anything about words." The church couldn't help. The family couldn't help. I couldn't help, even though I understood exactly what he was feeling. So he fell back on the old code, the one that says a man protects his family's honor regardless of cost. That code is older than law, older than civilization, and it's never going away no matter how many people we put in prison for following it. Was he wrong? Yes. Did he destroy 28 families, 14 on each side? Absolutely. Would I have done the same thing in his position? I've spent 16 years since retirement asking myself that question, and I still don't have an answer. The Williams family story has become legend in Detroit. A cautionary tale told in barbershops and on corners, passed down through generations with details that shift and change, but core truth that remains constant. Don't disrespect the dead. Don't underestimate what ordinary men will do when pushed. Don't mistake silence for acceptance. The story gets told different ways depending on who's telling it and why. Some versions make Robert Williams a hero, a man who defended his wife's honor against a world that didn't value black women's dignity. Some versions make him a monster, a man who murdered 14 people, including an innocent 19-year-old, over words spoken at a dice game. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the complicated middle, where most people don't want to look. Travis Williams, the youngest son, the only one who lived long enough to be released from prison, died on February 3rd, 2023 at 59 years old. Overdose, the medical examiner ruled, though whether intentional or accidental was impossible to determine. He'd been living in a homeless encampment under the I-94 overpass, struggling with addiction and post-traumatic stress the prison psychologists had never adequately treated. His body was found by a social worker who'd been trying to connect him with housing services. In his possessions was a single photograph, creased and faded, of his mother, Lorraine Williams, at a church picnic in 1976, smiling at the camera, young and beautiful, and completely unaware of everything her memory would cost. Also in his possessions was a letter he'd apparently been writing, though to whom was unclear. The letter was 3 pages of shaky handwriting, portions illegible, but the parts that could be read suggested a man trying to explain, to justify, to understand decisions made 37 years earlier when he was 22 years old and believed that honor mattered more than law. I don't know if what we did was right, one section read. I know what we did was wrong by every definition that matters. But I also know that Dolo disrespected Mama, and Daddy tried every way he could think of to make it right without violence, and when all those ways failed, what was left except the old code? The letter had no ending. Travis had apparently stopped writing mid-sentence, set it aside, taken the drugs that would kill him, and disappeared into the same streets that had created him. There's no memorial in Detroit for the 14 victims of the Williams family massacre. No plaque, no historical marker, no acknowledgement that this was the site of one of the city's most calculated mass murders. The city just moved on the way cities do, covering horror with progress, burying bodies under new development, pretending that if we don't talk about violence, it somehow didn't happen. But the story persists because it asks questions Detroit still can't answer. Questions about honor and law, about what we owe the dead, about where we draw the line between protecting dignity and becoming monsters, about whether justice exists when systems fail to recognize what matters most to the people they're supposed to serve. Robert Williams defended his wife's memory, and in doing so destroyed his family more completely than any insult ever could. He eliminated 14 threats to his honor, and in the process proved that honor without humanity is just violence wearing a respectable mask. He followed a code older than law and discovered that some codes cost more than they're worth, that revenge doesn't heal wounds but only creates new ones, that killing in the name of love still leaves you with blood on your hands and emptiness where family used to be. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. At what point does defending what we love transform us into the very thing we're fighting against? When does protection become destruction? When does honor become horror? And how many lives is one dead woman's dignity worth? If this story made you think about codes, about honor, about the price we pay when systems fail and old ways collide with modern law, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about street justice and institutional failure, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when pushed past limits they didn't know they had. Comment below. What would you have done in Robert Williams's position? Where do you draw the line between defending your family's honor and destroying your family's future? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now somewhere in forgotten neighborhoods where codes replace institutions and desperate people make choices they can never take back. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One insult, one system failure, one desperate November night at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance isn't drawn in law books, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, and always been hardest to find our way back from.